Hey there, just doing a reissue of my grid alignment video, just to improve the quality a bit and also to add on a few more tips at the end. So the best way to get a grid aligned in Foundry to a map that uses a grid itself is to know the grid dimensions of the map. Most creators these days will tell you what their grid size is, and if you can get the grid size, all you need to do is enter that into the grid configuration, and it should match up. So I happen to know that this map uses a grid of 70 pixels, so if I enter that in and save, my map is perfectly aligned. Now that magic number isn't always available, and even if you do get that number, sometimes it's not quite accurate. So we need another couple of ways to align the grid. The main one that I use in-game is an iterative approach that's basically just some quick trial and error that gets you closer and closer to a good result. Here's how that works. So I messed with the image scale of this map in an external editor just so that we don't know the scale of it going in, and now we can try aligning it. So we're going to go into the configure scene, and this time instead of being able to enter a number directly, we're going to use the grid configuration tool to try and find it. Now using this method, you actually get to pick your own grid size. You can choose whatever number works best for you and your assets and how you want to be able to zoom on the scene. So I usually just leave this at 100. We're not going to touch that because you can't enter decimal values for the grid size field, and we need more precision than just integers. So we're going to use the background image scale for all of our scaling. The first step is to align one grid square as best you can up in the corner. I'm going to use the arrow keys on my keyboard to shift the two grids relative to each other. And I'm going to get one intersection as lined up as possible. And then we look at what's happening in that one square. The background grid is too small compared to the 100 pix grid size that we chose. So we need to scale it up. So we pick a number that's a good ballpark guess, maybe 1.2. Now when you make a change in here, you don't have to click the Commit Changes button and go all the way out and back in. You can click anywhere in this window to register the change. You'll have to realign your grid again with the arrow keys, but now we have a different scale. So after putting 1.2 in there, I've made the background grid too large. You can see it's pushing past the Foundry grid now. So 1.2 has gone too far. I'll try 1.1, click in the window, realign with my arrow keys, and get it about as good as I can right here. That looks great, but as we move farther away, you can see it's getting away from us, and it looks like it's in the direction of the background being too small. It's not keeping up with the Foundry grid. So it's somewhere in between 1.1 and 1.2, so we split the difference with another decimal point, 1.15. Click in the window, use your arrow keys to align, and see how we do. And now it looks like our background image is too big. So we've got to back it off a bit. How about 1.12? Click, align, check again. Still too big, but only by a small amount. And in fact, if we went to the center of our map and ballparked the grid in around the middle here, which would look kind of like that, then even when we get out to the edges, these are actually basically close enough for most of what you're going to do. A trick is if you don't want to spend a lot of time getting closer than this, you can commit the changes just as is, and in the scene configuration, drop the grid opacity all the way down to 0. This will make your slight misalignment at the edges disappear, and when you've got tokens moving around here, nobody's going to notice that they're off by a few pixels. But of course you might want to make it perfect. So let's go back into the configuration tool. Sometimes for deeply mysterious reasons, Foundry will decide to throw in an insane decimal value in here, but you can usually tell what it used to be. This is extremely close to 1.12, which is what we had in there before. So if you see something weird like that, you can just round it off. So we were at 1.12. Let's get back into a corner here. use the arrow keys to align, look at which way we're going. The background's too big, so we're going to drop this down to 1.15, align again, check what's happening. We're very close, so it's still a little too big, so maybe 1.14. Align again. I'm just aligning wherever I am right now, and then start scrolling around. And I think that's pretty much nailed it. So now we've got a perfect grid alignment starting from an unknown value. Now another way to go about this is using a little bit of math in an external image editor. This will get you a precise value if you happen to have a map that has grid squares that go edge to edge. It doesn't work so well if you have an unknown amount of margin around the map. But you can also trim that off, leaving just the gridded area, and then this method will work too. So what we're going to do is count the number of grid squares, either vertically or horizontally. And in this map, my horizontal squares are slightly harder to count than this wide open set of tile here. And I've counted these previously. There's 32 of them in the vertical direction here. So if I wanted to have a grid size in Foundry of 100 pixels, then 32 grid squares should mean that my image file would be 3200 pixels tall. And my pixel size is not 3200. It's a little small. So I'm going to go into the image size control for this file, and I'm going to edit the height to 3200 pixels. Now in this case, because the image is square, my width is also setting to 3200, but if it was a rectangle, just let it calculate what the width should be using proportional scaling. We'll leave everything else as is and tell it to resize. Now I'm going to save this map and load it in as a new scene in Foundry. So here's that map loaded in as a brand new scene in Foundry. I haven't touched the configuration at all. Just with the default grid size of 100, which is what I was aiming for. I'll bump up the opacity on the Foundry grid here so you can see we have a perfect match. And what if you are aligning your grid and you come across something like this, where we have the vertical grid lines are perfectly matched all across the width of the image. So this is an exactly 100 pix grid horizontally, but vertically it's getting out of control. So what we've got here is a grid that is not square. And unfortunately, there's a lot of maps out there that exhibit this to some extent. Now you can use an external image editor to fairly quickly shrink in one dimension, but you can also do this tweak in Foundry fairly easily. So here's how you do that. So in the configuration for the scene, we have manual control over the width and height of the scene itself. And because these two are not linked proportionally, we can squash or stretch the image by changing one of them at a time. Now, I happen to know that this image was 3200 square, so just changing this to 3200 would fix this. But if you didn't know that, what you could do is just sort of nudge this down, because in this case it's the height that is wrong, until you get close to what you want. So I could go to maybe 3300, save changes, approve the warning, see that it's gotten better but not good enough, go back in, 3200, and so on. And now we should be on in both dimensions. Now our offset is not correct. We need to nudge this with our arrow keys. But one drawback to this method is that currently the grid configuration tool gets a little confused when you have overridden the scene dimensions compared to the map file dimensions. So if you go into here now, you'll notice that our scene squishing that we just did is not taking place in this view. So if you're going to use this method, you'll need to do your offsetting visually back in the scene config screen here. You can type in values right into these fields. And in this case with this map, because the grid extends right to the edges of the map, we don't need any offset at all. It should be just 0, 0 for this. So we can just manually type in 0 and 0. You don't see that live, but we can hit Save Changes, and now we're back and aligned. The nice thing about all of these methods is that they all work for hex grids as well. The calculations for doing the mathematical scaling method are a little weirder with the hex units, but it's still totally doable. And the iterative approach with just doing in-game BG image scaling totally works with hexes as long as they're actually regular hexagons that you're working with. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that helps.